Just want to make sure that we are live. Does it say live? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. All right. So I guess we're saving the best for the last, right? Friday. It's 4:35 East Coast time. Some of you are on the West Coast, so you've got a few more hours left. I'm delighted to moderate this panel about risk management discussion with a very experienced group of people who represent a diverse range of companies. We have Wouter Schull, and let me know if I pronounced your name right, who works for Sangamo Therapeutics, which is a genomic medicine company focused on gene therapy, cell therapy, and in vivo genome regulation. Compounds in development are in various stages of development, from preclinical to phase 3, and in partnership with companies such as Sanofi, Pfizer, Biogen, among others. Maithili Dalvi, she works at 23andMe, which is a genetics, health, and ancestry company, the company that has a direct-to-consumer DNA test. And also they have a therapeutic division which looks into identifying novel targets. The 23andMe is currently a private company which intends to go public. And then finally, Stephen Smith, who works at Encoded Therapeutics, which is a genomics-driven precision medicine company overcoming limitations of gene therapy. And Encoded Therapeutics is a private company. So with that background, and everybody heard a pretty good discussion on projects previous to this. Anytime you've got a project, there are risks, whether there are technical risks or budget risks or timeline risks. There's a whole host of risks. So Wouter, we'll start out with you. That how do you approach risk management, especially when you got partnership with major pharma companies? Your company being a smaller biotech company. So just if you can provide a preview of how risk management is done in that kind of a setting.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Darshan. So, well, risk management in our company is done through a standardized risk exercise and processes. So, we have a standardized way of qualifying them. It's kind of loosely based on the PMI method, with probability and impact that everybody is familiar with, and then using a standardized matrix of benchmarks to scale against, like what kind of probability level and what kind of impact level, so that it's not different per project. And then risk register, etc. So your question is then, how do we do this with corporate partners? That is a good question. That is challenging. Actually, what we mostly do is to really focus on our own activity. A lot of our activities are really 90% with Sangamo, and we work with the partner for some small things, but a lot of it is really just advice and reporting at that stage. So we mostly focus on our internal activities and risks, because it is very hard to assess risks that span across into the other company, right? To say, okay, we do try to assess that in our internal process to say what is the risk that the partner may not be able to provide certain material, but we don't involve them into the risk exercise, because that would just be too complicated to start sharing what we perceive as a risk and as they perceive. So we keep it separately. It would actually be interesting to hear if others do that differently in any partnered projects.
So I'll come to Maithili, because similar to you, Maithili, your company has major partnership with GSK. So it'd be good to hear about how an entrepreneurial type of a younger company tries to bridge risk discussion with a partner like GSK, which may be much more, regimented in their ways of approaching risks and mitigating risks.
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, in my role as a portfolio manager, but also as an alliance manager, I get to see both sides of the story, meaning that I get to see how a big pharma perceives risk versus how we do at 23andMe. And so, I mean, there are multiple cultural differences between the two companies, as you can imagine, in our ways of working, but also in terms of how we assess risk and how we perceive them. So we have different risk attitudes. Without generalizing too much, I think startups typically are more risk-seeking because they're going after novel and innovative products or targets. And then larger companies, because of the fact that their portfolios are so large, tend to be more risk averse, or at least their risk gets balanced out throughout the larger portfolio. And so in terms of how do we do it in the collaboration, I think it really comes down to drilling down on the basics. So first of all, identifying the differences in risk attitude, like I mentioned earlier, and what drives those differences in perception. And then also looking at commonalities and how we perceive risk. For instance, there might be certain disease areas in which both companies might have the same risk level. And so identifying both differences as well as commonalities, and then really leveraging that knowledge in the context of a joint governance meeting and setting a clear strategic direction for the collaboration as a whole. So GSK might have a different risk profile internally. We might have a different risk profile internally for our portfolio, but as a collaboration, we set different risk profile for that alliance, and that really helps us drive the portfolio forward.
Okay, thanks, Mithili. Finally, Stephen, yours is a completely different kind of an environment, startup mode. So how do you go about risk management in a startup environment?
Yeah, it's I've been in a couple of startups, and it's always a challenge to establish a sort of a risk assessment and risk management process. If you have a lot of your leadership coming from larger companies, pharma, before they're aware of the value of doing a full risk assessment and the need for doing risk management. Sometimes if you have a mix of folks that are very entrepreneurial, that have started their own companies and don't necessarily have come from big pharma and understand the value, it can be a challenge. So it's finding the right balance of doing your risk assessments and management that fits best with the company culture and that fits best with sort of the leadership, so that you're demonstrating value. In my past lives with a couple of startup companies, going through a risk assessment in a very formal way, there can be resistance. Some people don't see the value of the time and the resources spent in doing those. But I have to say, in every one of those situations where I faced sort of initial resistance, once we've gone through the process, folks that had not gone through it before do recognize the value of the cross communication that occurs as you're, one, trying to identify the risks that you feel are actually risks, talking through mitigations for those risks. And what we do is the typical sort of standard that Richard talked about with the format, where we do assign folks who would then be responsible for the mitigation plan and also monitoring that risk on an ongoing basis. The one thing we also do is put a due date down there so we can circle back to those individual risks and see if the mitigation has taken effect or not. So in a startup environment, it can be challenging to set something in place, but in every instance I've had coming out of it, folks have said that was really great, that we would not have communicated at this level if we had not gone through this formal process.
Right. So picking up on a couple of points that I think were mentioned, risk management, when we try to execute risk management, obviously that's got much more quantitative aspects to it, right? I mean, assigning number scales and then assigning numbers, whether it's to the likelihood or the impact. Wouter, you might have mentioned earlier in some of the other discussion, there is a cultural aspect, but there's also an emotional aspect to risks. And how do you go about, bringing that into the picture while you cannot quantify those, but still have to integrate them to really get a fuller picture of the risks? So maybe we'll start in the reverse order. So Stephen, if you want to go, try to integrate the cultural as well as kind of the emotional aspects of risks, where people's understanding of it might be very different person to person.
Yeah, it takes a little time. I mean, we do like to quantify sort of these risks, and sometimes it's a little bit hard for folks to wrap their heads around a particular scoring mechanism for probability, the impact, things like that. Once you start rolling through it, it becomes clearer for folks. And really, I explain the reason we want to quantify those risks is we can't manage hundreds and hundreds of risks all at the same time, and they're not equal in their impact. And we do have to differentiate those so that we can target the ones that we can need to follow more closely, and others that we can catch up. And so culturally, some folks may find it challenging to assign a number to something because it's maybe too general or too vague. But in most cases, I feel like we do get there with some education, and as long as we don't sort of overdo it. And I've also modulated sort of risk assessment and management on various levels. So we can get down, when we talk about CMC risks, we're talking about each sort of operational unit, and that's very detailed and minutia, all the way up to sort of corporate level program risks. And sometimes the scoring, is particular for the level of risk, but you get there. You get there as long as you explain to the team the purpose of quantifying them.
Okay, Wouter?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's I think a fascinating aspect of risk is this emotional component. So, I mean, it goes to personalities, to culture. There's people who don't even want to talk about risk because they say, "Why are you being so negative? Why are you talking about things going wrong all the time?" Right? So but that's not the point. So you have to get past that. There's also people who have the opposite. They're saying, "Oh, if you're not taking lots of risk, you're not trying hard enough, right? If you have low risk, then you should push harder, right?" So there is that aspect, and then there's also very interesting. I've noticed this over the years is that there's a certain level of anxiety with people who haven't had a chance to put risks on the board. So before you've done a risk identification exercise and made a risk register, there are people actually in your team that may be walking around with this concern, like this could go wrong, and we haven't even talked about it. They may be more also the introverted type that don't just kind of blurt it out all the time. So, and then when you've done that exercise, you can see their anxiety level goes down because now that risk is on the board. It has been identified, even quantified, and it may even end up in the middle to low category. So it may not even be that bad, but they may have been having this issue that they've been walking around with this perceived concern that's been kind of bothering them for a long time. So that's an aspect of it, that just being heard that my concern, because we've been talking about this other risk all the time, and now so all of these things are also part of it. Yeah, and then of course there's the whole fear factor of what if things go wrong and how do we deal with that? So I think there's a lot of emotional components. I mean, even the word risk could mean different things to some people, right? I mean, in project management, we have defined it now in a somewhat quantifying formula, by multiplying things and scoring them. But for a lot of people who are not so familiar with them, that risk means all kinds of things. Which come with their emotions. So anyway, so I think it's very important to
so I guess the key word is that, really listening to your team members and trying to understand maybe their point of view, where they're coming from, and seeking out that emotional aspect.
Yes.
Methalie, if you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just to expand on what Wouter and Steve already mentioned, it's really important to reduce that subjectivity in scoring. What I might score as 2 could be 4 for somebody. And so clearly defining the criteria that go into the scoring is really important. And then getting all the stakeholders together in the same room, perhaps through a risk workshop or a risk planning meeting, might also help, where you basically educate everybody what the scoring criteria are and how exactly we're going to score those. And then also reducing any kind of bias, because, for instance, a functional lead might feel like one risk is to be scored higher than the others. But if everybody's in the same room, people get that opportunity to voice out any disagreements, and again, reduce bias in that process. And then just one additional point to add is that, scores don't mean anything until you make something out of them. And so essentially, once you've devised your risk response plan, it's also important to then understand what your residual risk is. what would be the residual impact and the likelihood of occurrence. And then that really helps you put everything into context in terms of what was the primary score that you assigned and what is the potential to mitigate it or reduce it. So that brings the whole context together for all the stakeholders.
Okay, great. We have a question that I want to integrate some of the questions that are coming through because we've got only a few more minutes left. Any thoughts about risk tolerance level in your company? So again, maybe at a company, obviously there will be risk tolerance at a project level, but at a company level. So maybe Stephen, is there some kind of a risk tolerance level at a company level for the risks?
Yeah, and I think you assess that too, and I think my colleagues here have sort of said it beautifully, is that every company is different. And I've worked in a lot of startups where the risk tolerance is very high because they recognize that, we may have a single program that we're pushing through and everything is laden into that program. When you get to a larger company, you're perhaps sometimes dispersing or spreading out your risk because you have a portfolio. And the challenge I've seen sometimes is when you have, when you're trying to work in alliances. I've also done a little bit of alliance management and trying to get these two very polar opposite perceptions of risks to work together, where, if you have sort of these project teams with a lot of your C-suite folks on for the small company, and then you've got a project team in the big company, the conversations always center around the huge delta between the risk tolerance of the two companies. And it becomes very clear. And even in the PMOs that I've been a part of, assessing and getting guidance from your leadership on their risk tolerance is one of the first things you do in sort of stakeholder management, is understanding how am I approaching this. And I've been in situations where, assume a timeline, assume a project plan, and assume all risks, because we're fine with it. We know there's risks everywhere along the way, but we want to go perhaps as fast as we can, as quick as we can, and we're going to assume that there's a high probability that all these risks might hit, but that's the approach we want to take in our strategy. So, okay. And that comes usually from the very top on how things are communicated and planned for.
Right. Mithili, risk tolerance.
Yeah, I would say generally high, but again, that's a very subjective answer. Like I mentioned earlier, startups typically have a high risk tolerance because we are trying to enter into a novel or innovative space. And so, typically we do make decisions that might be considered like more risky by other organizations. But the whole idea is to other than identifying innovation, also moving things faster, accelerating, and being very nimble and agile in your process. So I think that's where we bring in the risk in our portfolio.
Right. And finally, Wouter?
Yeah, also interesting. Sometimes people have a kind of an intrinsic high risk tolerance, but what I sometimes do is I sketch out scenarios and I really show people like, okay, this is really what it means, right? So that because high risk means either a higher probability or a higher impact or both, that something goes wrong. And because I sometimes call this the Bruce Willis mentality, where you think like, you can just take enormous risk and jump out of a burning building, but you'll still land on your feet and you'll be okay. But that's actually not what it is, right? Higher risk really means that you have increased the chance of something going wrong, and there's like a major, it's not like just by taking more risk, it will be fine. No, that's actually, the definition of higher risk means that you have increased the likelihood that something will go wrong and that it will go wrong badly. So then you scope out those scenarios, and then sometimes people say, oh, wait, I don't want that. I don't want that, I can wait another month if we can avoid a $10 million impact if this goes wrong, right? So you have to really make it very explicit so that you get beyond this kind of generic risk tolerance and that people really accept a very explicit risks that know what they're getting themselves into. So,
and to Stephen's point earlier, the risk appetite for a private company versus a public company is going to be very different. Private companies don't have to publish SEC documents, Securities and Exchange Commission documents. On the other hand, public companies do have to periodically, the 10Ks, the 10Qs, and so on, explicitly, spell out the risks with the entire company, and obviously that would include project level descriptions as well. So you may want to, people who are looking into risks may want to check out SEC documents, especially for publicly traded companies. We've got a few more minutes left. There is a question about what is the contingency allocated for risks. So I don't know whether in your respective companies, do you have any percentage allocated for risks? So we'll start with you, Wouter. If there is any percentage amount dedicated either at a project level or at the company level.
No, I'm not quite sure percentage of what.
Some kind of a budget. So if there is like 5% of the budget or 10% is a part of the contingency planning. No, I mean for biotech and smaller companies, I think time is actually much more important than money. I mean, there's of course a certain budget, and then there's extra, but it's not set aside. It is really more the impact that we measure is more about time often than financial, although financial is important as well. But a company that is in this biotech spaces would actually be happy to spend more money if they could gain time, and you can't set aside time as a buffer. So we don't have that specifically. Okay, Stephen.
Yeah, I agree. I've been in a couple of startups and mid-sized companies, and I haven't had any experience in any of my companies where we've had sort of a contingency sort of budget set aside. I know that does exist, and I think maybe in some other industries they do have that. We do the exercises that we always go through is, rather than sort of set aside something for a contingency, is that we start to budget and put aside costs for activities as part of our mitigation. Mm-hmm. So rather than a contingency, it's a mitigation, because if we say there's a risk that this is happening, but if we did these things at those times, we would minimize the impact of the risk, then that would be money well spent. And I agree with Walter too. It's less about money and more about time and mm-hmm. not losing the time. So that's how we've handled it from a sort of a budget perspective, is costs associated to mitigation activities rather than a contingency sort of fund off to the side.
Okay. And finally, Maithili?
Yeah, similar to what Stephen and Wouter said here, we don't really have a contingency budget per se. But I will say this, that we typically do let our projects run over the budget if that does happen. So there's like a threshold that we have, which is 10%. And you could look at it as a contingency budget of sorts, even though we don't call it specifically as contingency.
Right. My experience at Big Pharma, and even the company that I work at, about 10% on the budget side, and then with timing, at least in my past experiences, it's been around 3 months. So whatever your timing might be, let's say submission planning timing, you might have a window of about 3 months variation. So anything that exceeds that, if you estimate that it's going to exceed that, obviously you have to go through the governance processes. We've got only a couple more minutes left. So to bring it to a close, what I'll do is probably just go around and do like 3 key takeaways that you would like our audience to take away in terms of risk management. So Maithili, we'll start with you. 3 key takeaways.
Yeah, I'll say consider the size of your organization as well as the size of your portfolio to make sure you're selecting the right processes for risk assessment and risk management without making it super cumbersome for the team. The second one would be make sure you're taking the organizational culture into account, risk attitude, like I mentioned earlier, again, to make sure you're selecting the right processes and the right technique. And then lastly, one thing that we touched on a little bit but didn't expand much was like making sure you're engaging your stakeholders throughout the process, right from risk planning all the way end to end, and making sure that there's transparent communication with your stakeholders on the risks and how those risks are evolving, if there are new risks that are emerging. So third thing was stakeholder engagement.
Okay, great. Stephen?
Yeah, I think those three were great. I would add maybe two more. Some folks always ask me, how do you measure success in your risk assessment and risk management? And it's always very hard. And I always give sort of generic answers is maybe you can't quantify this, but have you created an environment in your organization where you can respond to risks that occur very quickly? So it's that response time. Do you have the mitigation in place? And it's hard to quantify how if that's the case. And then another success criteria that I like is when I'm attending sort of sub-team meetings of different functions, and we've done sort of high-level risk assessments that, you know, coming out naturally from those discussions, those sub-teams will say, hey, wait a minute, we have a risk here. And rather than just adding it to a risk register, they say, hey, I think we need to put some time aside and do a risk assessment and use the tool. And I know that I've made huge progress if I can get the sub-teams in functional areas to actually do that as well on their own.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Wouter?
Thank you. Yeah, I think those are all excellent points. I love that last example from Stephen. So I just want to reiterate this emotional part, to be aware that, you know, that people have different ideas about this, and that people respond to risks. They have all kind of different ideas. So just be aware of that. And also, we didn't talk about it, but there's the challenge of managing risk over time, right? This is one thing to do a risk exercise and to make a beautiful risk register. And then what? So a month later, 2 months later, you have to, like what Stephen was saying, you have to kind of keep looking at it, to keep updating it. And that is even more challenging, I find, than setting it up well at the beginning. You can make that moment in time where you have it all nicely mapped out, but then how do you do it over time that comes after that? It takes time and effort, and you have to set aside that time, and you have to also educate, or educate is maybe the wrong word, but get your team on board to keep managing it, because you can't just do it on your own. So as a project manager, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we're just out of time. Thank you, everybody, Maithili, Stephen, and Wouter, for your excellent views on risk management. I hope the listeners got something out of this discussion. Obviously, this can go on for a longer time, but hopefully, we can reconvene at some other time in the future and have an even more greater discussion on this topic. But with that, I think we'll conclude and hand it back to Mithun.
Thank you, Darshan. Thank you, everyone. So Stephen, Wouter, and Maithili for these wonderful, wonderful ideas. I think we can continue a lot more on risk, and I think we can change a lot with just by having the right risk management strategy, by having the right processes and tools, but really going deeper, not just showing it in the reports, but going deeper with what we do with the risk really, and the human side of risk and all the actions that we can take on risk management. So wonderful. With this last panel discussion, I think you have really set the bar very high. And we'll go quickly off backstage, and then I'll come back for closing in a minute.
All right, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.